Our next session is going to be presented by Alistair Fairley, the co-founder and joint coordinator, as well as Liz Johnson, the Director of Technical Operations at Hastings Heart. The session is titled Using Digital to Recruit and Manage Your Volunteers on a Budget, which I'm sure is something lots of charities are thinking about right now, particularly in this sort of virtual kind of digital environment that we're working in as we go through 2021.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Alistair Fairley, and I'm the co-founder and joint coordinator of Hastings Heart, the Hastings Emergency Action Resilience Team. Liz, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Liz Johnson, and I've got the job of technical operations with Heart.
And our webinar is called Using Digital to Recruit and Manage Your Volunteers on a Budget. So we thought it would be helpful to start off with to just give an brief explanation about what Heart is and what we do. Basically, we are a mutual aid organisation, and we were set up right at the beginning of the pandemic in order to help support people cope with the impacts of COVID in our town of Hastings on the southeast coast of England. We do a whole variety of different things. We provide volunteers to support the delivery of food parcels at the Hastings Food Bank. We have provided drivers to key workers at the hospitals. We are now working with the NHS directly in hospitals. We do shopping for people who are isolating. We collect medications. We even walk dogs. We signpost to other organisations to enable people to get the other sort of support that they need. So we wanted to just first of all start talking about how we recruited our volunteers from the beginning, and we've got an awful lot of them. So the first thing that we did was we set up a Facebook group. It took 24 hours for us to come up with a name, the Hastings Emergency Action Resilience Team, which was originally the Hastings Emergency Action Response Team, but it's changed now because we want to actually carry on going, and that's called Heart. So we set up Heart, and we put a message out on Facebook to invite people to say, look, we just thought it might be an idea if we all got organised to help other people in the pandemic during lockdown. And we were absolutely overwhelmed with the response. We ended up with 3,200 members in our town of our Facebook group. We then had to figure out how we actually culled from those volunteers. So the first thing we did was set up a registration form on Google Docs, on a Google form for people to sign up and actually register as volunteers with their name, their details, and their address, and also to get an idea about what sort of things they were interested in doing. And then we also had to then figure out how on earth were we going to go and find out people that needed the help. We first of all thought it would be an idea to approach all of the other voluntary organisations in the town. So we were one of the founding members, up on the top left, of the Hastings Community Hub. And this now brings together all of the agencies that are involved in coordinating the response to the crisis, including the Borough Council, County Council, the NHS, and so forth. Our first idea was to go and use physical sheets of paper posted through people's letterboxes to say, help is there if you need it, please get in touch with me. And then all of a sudden it became problematic because of the transmission possibilities of being able to transmit COVID using physical documentation. So we realized we needed a website, and that's step 3, and that's our first website that we did, in which we had a help request form, again, using the digital approach, so that people would fill in a form online outlining the sort of help that they might need. And then lastly, in order to coordinate it, we all worked via Zoom, which came along just at the right time. And I think everybody knows the success story of Zoom. So that's the initial coordinating team that we have down in the bottom right. Liz, I don't know if you would like to take on the next stage and start explaining about some of the other things we did.
Yes, so the next link in the chain. We needed to store all our volunteer details in an accessible and searchable way. So we chose Nation Builder as it was integrated with the website and also has an emailing marketing function. So the first thing we did was we loaded all the registered volunteers that had filled in the Google form, and we created a database. So we had all their contact details, their areas of interest and capabilities, and these are stored as tags against each volunteer. So for example, we knew who was willing to go shopping for others, who was a graphic designer, who had tech skills. As a database, it allowed us to search for suitable volunteers by applying a filter. We then moved on and realised that we needed to match the two. So we had the help request response, which will link to the Google Sheet that was on our website. And we then created a jobs board, which is basically the spreadsheet of the information. We added column headings in pink so that it was clear that this information came from the help request. So we had, again, who needed help, their contact details, and the nature of the request. Using the Nation Builder database, we were able to find suitable volunteers to contact to see if they could help with a particular request. By then adding additional columns, which were in blue, we managed we use this to manage the help request. So which volunteer was assigned, what date they were assigned, and then the important part, which was the status of the help request, whether it was an open one, whether it was in progress, whether it had been completed, or sometimes whether it got moved to our ongoing board, i.e. it was a repetitive job that like a weekly shop. This means that anyone looking at the jobs board can see the status of the help request and who is involved. Over to you.
So there was the very considerable problems that then we had to face, which was how did we actually manage the growth? Because we discovered that as a result of having 3,200 members on our Facebook group, we then had signed up 1,070 volunteers, which is a huge response. It's absolutely fantastic, but at the same time needed to be managed. So the way that people, just to remind people, the way that people signed up was they went to the website, they were directed via the Facebook group to the website. They filled in the volunteer registration form with their details, and that was then linked in to the database. And because it was all automated, it meant that we could grow almost exponentially without actually having to do anything, any further intervention, because we'd set it up right at the start. There was then the question of how did we then manage the requests? And as people might imagine, at the beginning of the pandemic and throughout lockdown, there were huge numbers of requests that were coming through. Once again, through linking the help request form to the Google Sheet, we were able to actually cope with those, and things would feed through automatically onto our ongoing board. And because the volunteer coordinators, and there were a lot of them to start off with, and we needed a lot of them, were able to then go to the database, search the database by postcode, and find somebody local to where that person was who could actually go down the road and help them, or give them a call and help them, and not actually go too far out of their way in order to be able to do so. So these were very important aspects of setting things up right from the start that enabled us to actually grow almost exponentially. And over to you, Liz.
Okay, so a little bit more detail about how a database can help us manage digitally our requests, our volunteers. So basically with a database, it has tags, which it means that we can group and identify volunteers based on the tags. And we learned that it was important to have meaningful tags so that we knew that there were a few people that were all willing to help in a particular way. For example, willing to go shopping or walk a dog or chat with an isolated person. We also had tags which were particular fields. So for example, counsellor or nurse or graphic designer. And then with the database, we were able to use filters, which enabled us to combine tags using and or all statements so that we could create a filter to identify a particular group of volunteers. Nation Builder also has a filter option that enables search by distance from postcodes, which is really, really useful. And it was extremely helpful in trying to find volunteers who were as local as possible to the person in need. The other aspect of the database was that we enabled us to have targeted emails. So from a volunteer's point of view, we were able to send the same email to all our volunteers, for example, our newsletter, to keep them updated. We could also send emails, or we also do send emails to particular groups of volunteers using filters. We can, through the database, we can see how many have opened an email, who's clicked on links or forms, and it can all be tracked, which is incredibly useful when you're trying to do marketing campaigns. The database also allows forms to be filled in online on a website or a link, and that will automatically update the database. So we can ask our volunteers if there's a particular area that they want to get involved in, maybe with the food bank, and then we can that will automatically put a tag that says food bank. So it's a lot of information. One example where we use the database was to make sure that our volunteers have a disclosure and barring service certificate, otherwise known as a DBS. We wanted everybody to be able to have the enhanced volunteer certificate, which means that they have been checked and they are able to work with vulnerable adults and children. So we knew that our volunteers who had indicated that they already had a certificate, but we needed to get them to submit their certificates for verification. So we were able to send them a targeted email. For other volunteers who didn't have a DBS, we were able to send a target email to them, inviting them to apply for a DBS certificate. So by using tags, filters, targeted emails, forms, we could upload the information back to the database so that we could manage and track the DBS process. We now have a database of volunteers with tags that we are able to apply sophisticated filters. So for example, please find a volunteer near a particular postcode that has a verified DBS, that's willing to shop for somebody else and are not currently self-isolating. It's a very powerful tool.
So what this meant from our point of view was fantastic, because what we found was that in addition to responding to individual requests from people out in the community, which people would do by filling in a help request form, by working through the community hub, there were quite a number of other organisations that needed lots of volunteers supported provided to them very quickly. They might be drivers for the Hastings Food Bank. They might be people to set up the befriending service for Hastings Voluntary Action, or people to advise people with regard to benefits advice for citizens advice and so on. So in order to do that, what we then would set up is an online form, again, a Google form, which would ask people, we would then send out an email, whether it would be direct via our newsletter or it would be a targeted email to those that might be, say, DBS checked, say, for example. Would you be willing to help with this particular task? And we'd term it in a nice, friendly way. They would click on the link, it would go through to the form, they would fill in the form, and then we would have a detailed list of all those people who had actually stepped up to volunteer for a particular program or project. What that meant was that we were able to then send off batches of volunteers to people like the Food Bank or Education Futures Trust, which support families in need in our local town. And that's actually incredibly powerful, because quite often these organisations can find themselves very stressed at particular moments. The Hastings Food Bank, I've only just discovered this morning, in January, it had its third busiest month. And that is already an organisation which has tripled in size since the beginning of the pandemic. We've now been able to provide them with 18 fully checked, qualified drivers who can actually deliver all of these food parcels around the town free of charge, and are more than willing to do so. And it's been incredibly helpful from our point of view to be able to find that kind of task for volunteers to be able to do swiftly, easily, and with the minimum fuss. And over to you, Liz.
Thanks. Keep it simple. So this is all about making things user-friendly and simple to understand. We know, or I know from my previous background, that there are a lot of people that are scared of spreadsheets and they worry about making a mistake, or they're not sure whether they should fill something in, or what they should fill in, or how to fill it in. So what we did was we looked at spreadsheets, in our case the jobs board in particular, and we made sure that we had protected ranges so they couldn't accidentally delete data. We introduced drop-down menus so that they could select what the response should be, and they didn't have to remember, oh, what do I have to type in that column? And it also means that everybody was using the same information, and there was a reassurance, so it became less scary for people to feel that they were having to, make changes to a spreadsheet. We also introduced conditional formatting so that a cell would change colour depending on a condition. So, for example, on the jobs board, we have a next callback date. So that's to check whether somebody might need shopping the next week. And that automatically changes from green, which is obviously in the future, to amber, meaning we need to deal with it today, or to red if for any reason we didn't deal with it today and therefore it becomes outstanding. It makes it super easy for any coordinator or anybody to go in to see what tasks need to be done first. And it's all automatic. It does it automatically as the date changes. We also found that colour coding was particularly useful for rotas because, again, it was easy to see where there were slots. It was easy to see who had put themselves up for particular days or particular hours within a day. For example, in the peak, last year, we had nearly 50 volunteer coordinators who were covering the live board from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. 7 days a week, and they all would take 2-hour slots. So it was really important that the rota was easy to use and encouraged our volunteers to sign up, if you like, for a slot. Excuse me. We've also found that there is a wealth of information, and we're constantly sending emails and with information, and it gets very confusing. You can't find where was that email that somebody sent me about so and so, so and so. So we've created central repositories of information and a lot of shared documents so that a document can be accessed, viewed, updated, edited, depending on who has access to do that. We also looked at making sure that we had folders and subfolders so that all the information for a particular area is in one place. And again, by setting access rights so that it was easy for that particular person to be able to see the areas that they needed to. We created documents that had links in them so they didn't have to know where to go to find a particular bit of information. For example, meeting schedules and minutes has one document, it has the Zoom link for the meeting, but it also has the link to the previous week's minutes or the previous time's minutes. And then digital handbooks. So this is relatively recent. We've been sending out the handbook as an attachment. This means that our volunteers can have it on their computer at ease. They can print it if they really want to. Some people still prefer, printed documents. But on the end of it, it has a digital submission button, which means this will automatically update our database so we know who's received the email with the handbook and also who's read the actual handbook. And finally, guidelines. Well, guidelines, and we've tried to store them somewhere where they were accessible to everyone that needed them. So, for example, policies, we have them on our website. We have access to them, and it means that we can always make sure that they reflect the latest information. We tried to make any manuals, handbooks, guidelines as friendly as possible, easy to follow, lots and lots of pictures, step-by-step guides, so that at the end of the day, no one is scared of technology. Moving on to where are we now? Well, we're in the process of, we've just done a massive refresh on our website. We decided that we wanted to make it, refresh it with new content and make the look and feel of it even better and even more accessible. We've been introducing volunteer roles so that we can clearly explain, depending on the role selected, what is involved. Some are out about in the community, and there's some that are team building ones, which are generally home or Zoom based. It's proving that we can, by contacting volunteers again, either by targeted emails, or in sometimes we have a ring team of volunteers that are ringing other volunteers to refresh, find out what their current availability is, their situation, and it's proving to be a good way back for the community to all get together.
And that's been incredibly important, Liz, hasn't it? Because the refresh, we were unsure after the initial lockdown. Of course, during the initial lockdown, everybody was at home. It was really easy. Now everybody's gone back to work, or they may have gone back to work, and we didn't know exactly what their particular position was. So we felt that we needed to contact all of them again. Well, when you're talking about 1,070 volunteers and on your database, that's a huge undertaking in itself. So we've had to have a blended approach, both by using the telephone and by email, to actually re-engage those people so that we can actually get a better picture of what their availability might be, or indeed whether their preferences have changed. Some people's situations changed. Some people are now back driving. Some people are not able to work on a Sunday, or have got childcare duties, whatever it might be. Most importantly, I think the other thing, what that has done in terms of being able to recruit and manage the volunteers, is that it's actually given us the opportunity to then build teams to build teams. This has been really, really important to take us on to the next stage, because as I said, the organization changed from becoming an emergency action response team to something which is actually an emergency action resilience team, because we know that the impacts of COVID are going to be felt for many, many months to come, if not years. And we knew that we had a huge volunteer cohort that was willing and able and up for it to help as best they could, if only they could be directed as to the best way to help. So we felt it was very important to actually continue to build the teams. And what better to build the teams than the other volunteers? So we created teams within our organization of the volunteers to do a number of things. The DBS program, the Disclosure and Barring Certificate program, well, we had several hundred volunteers who had received a certificate, but we needed to make sure that we had seen a copy of the certificate, because some of them were held elsewhere. But we also wanted to make sure that as many people that wanted to get a DBS certificate and could qualify for one, that they would get one. So we actually set up a new DBS team to contact people and actually take them through that process and get them a free DBS certificate on their behalf. We have now been able to set up projects to run vaccination drivers in support of people to get to their vaccination centres. And this is actually going to be proving, I think, over the course of the next few months, a very important aspect of our work, because we've been able to then take people from our drivers pool and say, actually, we can assist you to get a vaccination because you will now be a key worker. And so vaccinated people will start to be able to drive people to their vaccination centre. And that, again, is a very important value added thing that we do in terms of managing our volunteers. We have a new project which is called Heart Buddies, which is about supporting people who might be isolated or vulnerable or lonely out in the community. It's a killer. It's one of the biggest hidden problems within the community. And we've set up a program which has enabled us to actually start linking people, to give people a weekly call. How are you doing? Do you need any further help? And train them up in terms of becoming a Heart Buddy. We've also been looking at actually supporting our volunteers, because we know that this has been a relentless process for people, and certainly we feel it ourselves. So we have set up in the middle, you'll see a thing. He looks a bit depressed. Well, that's because we've set up a counselling program for volunteers to cope with some of the sheer hell that it is of supporting people out in the community. Some of the stories that you come across are very distressing, and they take their toll. We did a trawl of our volunteer cohort and discovered that we had a dozen qualified counsellors and psychotherapists within our cohort. We've trained up 8 of them, and 6 of them now are going to be running nightly one-to-one personal confidential counselling sessions for up to an hour long for anybody in the voluntary sector in our town. Also, we are running what we call coffee break, which is a weekly and monthly check-in for all of our volunteers to come on board, feedback their ideas, meet each other, because it's a lonely job being a volunteer out during a pandemic, and actually get to know each other. Well, that's really important from a social perspective, and building the resilience in the teams. And then lastly, on the bottom right, we've got a thing which is actually happening well, by the time this has gone out, it will have happened on the 19th of February, which is an online broadcast event, which we are hosting on behalf of the Hastings Community Hub, with all of the top civic leaders that are taking part in it. And it's going to be following the question time format. And we're hosting it in order to be able to engage people out in the community. We're fed up with being told what to do. We'd like to be asked what our ideas are, and we'd like to hear from the community what their views are about how we could go about coping with COVID. So there's some ideas about what we've been trying to do to actually continue to manage our volunteers. What have we learned along the way, though? Because it's been a huge, long learning process. And I must say that one of the most important things that we've learned is that just about everything is doable. There is nothing that we haven't actually been able to somehow find a resolution for. But please bear with us. We have been learning every step of the way. We didn't know any of this when we started out, and there's no need for you to do so either. Secondly, in terms of if you want to actually get your volunteers engaged with things and get them motivated, network like crazy. Get out there, do what is needed, go to all the meetings, talk the talk, walk the walk, and find all of those other organizations that might need volunteer support as well. Or if you've got an organization which is running volunteers, get them out there and getting them working in the community to meet people, talk to people, and spread the word. It really works. Lastly, well, not lastly, but keeping it simple and logical is also fundamental. It's actually really essential to make sure that you think of your end user when you are communicating with them, whether it be a volunteer that you're trying to engage with a project or a task, or whether it be somebody out in the community that might need to access your service. Keeping it simple and straightforward is the most easy way to engage them in what you've got to do. Simple language, straightforward. You can be as chatty as you like. We work in the voluntary sector, for goodness sake. We don't have to be restricted by some of the rules and regulations that others do. We've got to be formal. We've got to be relatively formal, obviously, in the way, and professional in the way that we deal with them. But be friendly. And that also means that you have to moderate what you actually provide in terms of information. There's lots and lots of information you can flood people with and overwhelm them. So try and moderate it and take it step by step. And that way you won't actually flood them with information and basically turn them off. Last, we would say that it is important to be aware of data protection with all of this. Certainly if you're dealing with user information and patient information that can be highly confidential, you will need to make sure that you are okay on data protection aspects. You may well need to register with the data protection registrar. And certainly if you're doing any transfer of information between agencies, you will need a data sharing agreement. And that means that you have to review your systems. And that's not a bad métier throughout, which is to make sure that you are checking that whatever you're doing is the right thing to do. And lastly, we found feedback. It's cool. We wouldn't be able to exist if we hadn't got people behind you saying, well, I'm not sure that's the right way of doing it. You want that feedback. We do not have all of the answers. I personally believe that all of the answers are actually out there. And that's why I'm looking forward to the question and answer session, so that we can actually get some feedback about some of the things that we've been doing. And we'd like to know, because we're always interested in improving. So thank you very much for listening. We hope you haven't taken up too much of your time, and we're looking forward to having your questions. And do feel free to ask us whatever you can. We'll do our very level best to answer them. And if we don't know the answer, we'll tell you.
Hello. Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Liz, for joining us today for our Q&A. Alistair, we have confirmed video and sound, good to know. And Liz, also confirmed video and sound, good to know. I was slightly concerned we might have had a repeat of our very unexpected hiccup from earlier today, but my colleagues assure me everything has been appropriately wired and tested, so we're good to go. Thank you again for presenting the session. It was very interesting and very informative. Our participants, attendees even, I think found it very interesting as well. So I'll dive straight into the questions. Our first one comes from Owen, who asks, did you get a special sort of charity price for Nation Builder? And I think this is in reference to forms and things.
Shall I answer that one, Liz, or do you want to answer that?
I can answer in the sense that Nation Builder, it was offered as a free product to start with, because in response to COVID, because we'd set ourselves up as a mutual aid to help with the COVID pandemic. So that was free to start with.
And then going forward, it has been slightly augmented. Yes, it does cost. They have now stopped the free offer. Now, interestingly, one of our co-founders, my co-founder with me, Kim Batty, who's not here today, but I actually put her forward as an everyday leader, one of Nation Builder's everyday leaders. They had an awards program. Now, with that, funnily enough, she won. And it came with $1,000 worth of free Nation Builder software and support and service. So we're continuing to get a free service from them, but only because we got an award. What we did find was that they have a tiered process where in terms of the number of people you hold on your database, it will increase the costs of it. And that is a cost. No doubt, but it will be a cost whether you have worked with Nation Builder or whether you work with any other organization as well. These things do cost money, so you have to build that into your budgeting, and we've certainly built it in to our budgeting because we want to carry on and continue with our database going forward.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that. Our next question refers to platforms as well. Our anonymous attendee asks that you mentioned Facebook to recruit volunteers at the beginning. Is this still how you are recruiting volunteers, or do you use other platforms now?
We use just about every platform going. To be quite honest, we are in the process of recruiting volunteers. We're not saying no, but we did hold off for a start after we got so many, and we simply couldn't use them all. So we were not actively recruiting volunteers. Right now, if people want to volunteer and they want to be particularly active, they can go to our website. They will find out about that via Facebook. They will find it out via other organizations. They will find it out via Twitter. They will find it out via Instagram. We are on all of those platforms as well. And we also network through the Community Hub. We are shortly about to go back to old school and use a leaflet, funnily enough, which we're hoping to distribute out to the wider community via vaccination centres, via GP practices, because one of the things we also need to do is to reach some of the hardest to reach and loneliest and most vulnerable people in the community. And they can sometimes be not engaging with digital platforms at all. So we know that we need to get out there in other ways rather than just digital. But of course, you don't want to hear that because this is all about digital. But you have to find a mix.
Thank you. I think any pathway that leads to greater integration with the cause is definitely to be celebrated, digital and otherwise. Our next question does, however, steer us back to the digital direction, and it comes from Ali, who asks, what software do you use for the digital handbook?
That'll be for me to answer. Basically, we create a Word document, we save it as a PDF. Within that, at the end, it has a link to a Google form, which is just a simple fill in their name, email address, and submit it. So that way we then update the database. Actually, in that example, we use 123 forms because they interlink with the Nation Builder. So as soon as it's submitted by the volunteer, it automatically updates the database with a tag, so we know that they have, in this case, read a document or seen a document.
Some forms as well, some forms, some of those Word forms that are then translated into PDFs, you have to go back into them and actually make sure that your interactivity is working with your PDF, because it doesn't always translate, that the hyperlink within a Word document doesn't always translate into a PDF. But basically, once you've got a PDF, it can't be mucked around with. And you want to make, those are the ones that we would send out to individuals so that they can't actually amend them, but they can just use the interactivity and the hyperlinks and click through to any other form or field that we want to direct them towards.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Our next question refers also to handbooks and policies to volunteers and seeing who has read them. Could you recap on this, please? Sort of what process, how do you get that data?
It's similar to the previous questions. So basically, by using a digital form, it means that we can update the database. It updates the database automatically. So there's no need for backwards and forwards emails going, I've read it. We can automatically see, don't know how else to explain it. So.
No, that's fine. Brilliant. Thank you. It's always good to hear, because it's sort of, it's one statement, but there might be different aspects to it to different sort of attendees, and they might need it explained in a slightly sort of different way. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, it's about closing the loop. So it's all very well sending stuff out, but you want to make sure it's read. So we need to actually ask them to acknowledge that it's read, and that they've got the guidance and that they've read it and they've understood it. So you do need to close that loop. So always ask the question at the end of it.
Brilliant, thank you. And in terms of sort of, closing the loop and, keeping all the data secure and things, our next question from Christine covers a slightly similar subject, and she asks, how do you manage confidentiality and data protection with so many people having access to the database?
Okay, so the volunteers as such don't access the database. It's only the coordinators or people that have been given training in how to access the database. And by definition, they then have to have a login to the database. So we can control who has access to our database. In terms of anybody that does have access to data, whether it's client data or volunteer data, then again, we use a form that we send them as ask them to submit the form, and then that updates the database to say that they have read our GDPR agreement and that they have agreed that they will not share any data, etc. So again, we use a form to control so that we can automatically see who on the database. We couldn't track it individually because we're dealing with hundreds. And
I think the other thing to add there, Liz, is that when people go through the process of being approved as a volunteer, there is a process of approving a volunteer, and part of that is that we send them a GDPR form, which they have to actually say they have read and they will comply with. Now, again, just sending out a form doesn't mean anything, but it is the sort of process that you have to instill into a system so that people understand that they may be dealing with confidential information. Certainly if they are in contact with a clinically vulnerable or shielding individual, they may obtain information which could be very important for the coordinator to know about their condition, and that has to be forwarded back to the coordinator and put into any secure site and updated, so that only those people who are so authorized can actually access that information. When there is another, I think there may be another question, I don't know, but about, then you of course have the issue with regard to data sharing. So let's say you've got a referral coming to you from another organization. They may want to share that personal detail with you about what that client is experiencing. It could be whether they are depressed. It could be whether they just literally are on their beam end. Whatever it might be, there is a transfer of information between organizations. So you have to, where there is that transfer, you actually have to have agreements. It's really boring, but it is a matter of fact. Now, when originally the pandemic hit, in fact, this government suspended GDPR, but as a matter of policy, we felt that it was still very important to observe, because there was going to come a point when that wasn't going to be the case. And so we set it up right from the start. We entered into data sharing agreements with local authorities and other agencies, and which meant that in order to do that, we actually had to register with the data protection registrar as well. 40 quid per annum, but it's one of those things that you have to do. But yes.
Thank you for the information. I think that would be something that lots of charities are thinking about right now as we kind of adjust to the changes and sort of regulation, GDPR, Brexit and things. So that's quite very helpful to have. So thank you for that. Our next question is a similar sort of process-driven one, and it comes from Stephen, who asks, for volunteers who are interacting with clients, did you have to have the volunteers' DBS checked?
Yes. So we went through it's quite a long process. It was briefly explained in the clip. So a volunteer signs up. Some of them already had a DBS from previous voluntary option or their job, and in which case we would ask them to submit a copy of it so that we could check that it was up to date and it didn't have any barrings. For all of our volunteers that hadn't got a DBS, that wanted to be able to be out in the community, we offered them the ability to apply for a community enhanced COVID-related DBS. And again, that process took a couple of weeks per person. And again, we tracked and did that with as much automation as possible. Again, due to the numbers we were dealing with, we weren't dealing with ones or twos, we were dealing with hundreds.
And just to add to that, where there are obviously volunteer tasks which aren't necessarily directly involving interrelation with people out there in the community. If you are, for example, just delivering a food parcel and dropping it on at a door for the food bank, it is not absolutely essential to have a DBS check, but we do try to make sure that most of them are DBS checked anyway. But where there is interaction with that client and where that person might actually be sharing information or whatever it might be, it's very important that they have a DBS check. And that's why we've made taken such an exercise to enable so many of our volunteers to get DBS checked. And most people are very happy to get involved with it. And that again is part of the reputational aspect of the organisation, because we've taken the data protection and the disclosure and barring certification very seriously right from the start, because we knew that it was the one bit of experience that we could bring to the fold. We knew that it was going to be important.
Thank you. Our sort of final question for the morning, I think would be very interesting to some of our attendees, and it comes from Chantel, who says, this looks to be a great system for a large-scale volunteer programme. However, for a smaller team, do you see this still working and worth the investment?
Okay, I'll answer that one. In terms of investment, it took time, but until I think it was October, so we ran from March through to October, and our entire budget until that point had been £900, out of which we had also paid for 100 high-vis vests and masks, 400 posters, and all sorts of other bits and pieces. So the investment wasn't actually very, very great. It did take time, and that's of course the investment that you would be putting in as a volunteer. But it doesn't actually cost that much to do all of this stuff. There are a few costs, and going forward there will be costs, but the biggest cost was time.
Thank you. Okay, Liz, I think you had a final comment.
So yeah, I was just going to say that it's finding tools that are free. So we use Google Forms, we used Word documents. You find ways of doing things that are free, stroke cheap, and they are possibly, it's driven by the people that are involved.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for joining us here today, and thank you for your session as well.